The sun was melting into the horizon, painting the village sky with shades of orange and sorrow, when Ayesha's fate was sealed. At just 19, her hands trembled as her mother tied the last knot of red thread around her wrist, a symbol of purity and tradition that felt more like a chain than a blessing. She had grown up chasing sunlight through fields, dreaming of becoming a teacher, believing the world was big enough for her laughter to echo in. But that day, her laughter was buried under whispers of elders, promises of honor, and the clinking of coins exchanged for her future. Her father's face was pale, guilt shimmering in his eyes, but poverty had silenced his love. He's a good man, they said, hard-working, kind, a farmer with a small piece of land. But no one mentioned that his heart carried scars of loneliness and resentment. When Ayesha first saw Rafiq, her husband-to-be, he stood tall but worn, like the fields he tilled, his hands rough, his eyes dark, his smile forced. The wedding was simple, dust rising under the village's feet as drums echoed through the air, and yet Ayesha felt like she was watching someone else's life unfold. The garland of jasmine around her neck was heavy, suffocating, and when she looked at her mother for comfort, she saw tears hidden behind a fake smile. That night, as the stars scattered across the black sky, the world outside went quiet. Ayesha sat in a small mud brick room, her bridal veil covering her trembling face, heart pounding like a trapped bird. She had heard stories of first nights, of love, laughter, and gentle beginnings, but Rafiq's silence was louder than any storm. He entered without looking at her, placed a folded blanket on the floor, and sat with his back turned. Hours passed. The oil lamp flickered. She whispered, "Do you not want to see my face?" He didn't answer. When he finally spoke, his voice cracked with pain. "You should rest. Tomorrow is a long day." Confusion filled her chest. Was it anger, disgust, fear? She didn't know. He left before dawn, and when she stepped outside, villagers whispered again, about how strange he was, how he had changed since his first wife's death 2 years ago. Ayesha's heart sank. No one had told her she was marrying a widower. Days turned into weeks, and Rafiq barely spoke to her. He worked all day in the sun, came home silent, ate alone, and slept on the floor. She tried to talk, to smile, to win his heart, but he avoided her eyes. One night, she found him outside staring at the sky, tears rolling down his weathered face. "Why did you marry me if you don't want me?" she asked softly. He looked at her, finally, with a mix of pain and guilt that froze her heart. "Because your father begged me," he said. "And I thought, maybe God wanted me to fix what I broke." She didn't understand, not yet. But his words haunted her. In the following days, she noticed small things, his trembling hands when she spoke gently, the way he avoided certain songs, and the old photograph hidden in his drawer of a smiling woman and a baby. When she asked, he turned away. "Don't touch that," he said sharply, his tone laced with a pain too deep to question. But curiosity gnawed at her soul. One afternoon, while he was away, she unfolded the photo again and saw the truth. The woman in the picture was young and beautiful, holding a baby that looked just like Rafiq. On the back, in faded ink, were the words, "For our little angel, gone too soon." Tears burned Ayesha's eyes as realization struck. His wife and child had died, and she was now living among ghosts. That night, when Rafiq returned, he saw the photo in her hands. His face turned white. He didn't shout, didn't curse, he simply collapsed to his knees, whispering, "It was my fault." The words shattered the silence. He told her everything, how his wife had fallen ill, how he had gone to fetch medicine but returned too late, how the baby had died in her arms. "I buried them with these hands," he said, voice trembling. "And I swore I'd never love again. But your father begged me to save you from the city men who wanted to buy you." Ayesha's heart broke into 1,000 pieces. She saw him differently now, not as a cold man, but as someone haunted by love lost too soon. She knelt beside him, whispering, "You didn't save me, Rafiq, we can save each other." For the first time, he looked at her, not as a burden, not as a replacement, but as a soul who could understand his pain. The night grew quiet again, but this time, their silence was soft, almost healing. Days passed, and the walls between them slowly cracked. He began to eat with her, to speak gently, to teach her how to care for the crops. She learned to wake before dawn, her hands touching the earth with new strength. For the first time, she felt a strange peace in the rhythm of the farm, the wind, the rain, the soil, all whispering that maybe broken hearts could still grow something new. Yet, happiness is fragile in villages like theirs. One stormy night, Rafik didn't return from the fields. Hours later, men carried him home, bleeding, his leg crushed under a fallen tree. Ayesha's world spun as she screamed for help, pressing her hands against his wound. He opened his eyes, faintly smiling. "You were my light, Ayesha," he whispered. "I thought I was dead until you came." She held him tight, begging him not to leave, but fate had already written its cruel script. His breath faded with the wind. The next morning, the fields were silent again. The young widow stood alone under the rising sun, her red bridal bangles shattered on the ground. She looked at the land he loved so much and whispered, "I'll keep your promise, Rafik. I'll live." And from that day, she did, stronger, wiser, but with a heart forever carrying his memory. Morning came quietly, as if the sun itself was afraid to rise over Ayesha's pain. The world outside was moving again. The crows called, the oxen groaned, the women fetched water from the well, but inside that small mud house, time had stopped. Rafik's clothes still hung behind the door, smelling faintly of earth and sweat, and his old sandals rested where he'd left them the day before the storm. Ayesha sat beside the charpoy where his body had been laid, her fingers tracing the edge of the blanket that covered him for the last time. She hadn't shed a tear in front of anyone. The villagers had come, murmured words of pity, thrown handfuls of soil over the grave, and left. But when the last footstep faded, her heart broke open. The scream she had held in her chest all night finally escaped, echoing into the empty fields. She cried until her throat burned, until her hands trembled, until her voice became nothing but a whisper of his name. For days, Ayesha wandered through the house like a ghost, speaking to walls, cooking meals no one would eat, lighting the lamp at dusk because Rafik used to like the warm glow. His absence filled every corner. At night, when the rain fell, she would wake thinking he had returned, the door creaking, his voice calling her, but it was always the wind. Yet within that pain, something quiet began to grow. On the 7th day after his burial, she walked to the fields alone. The soil was damp, the furrows broken from the storm, but she knelt down and pressed her palm into the earth. "You gave him peace," she whispered to the land. "Now give me strength." From that moment, she made a decision that would change everything. She would keep the farm alive. The villagers laughed when they saw her with a sickle in her hand. "A widow plowing fields," they said. "The land will curse her." But Ayesha didn't listen. Every morning before sunrise, she tied her dupatta, rolled up her sleeves, and stepped into the fields that had once been her husband's pride. Her hands bled, her back ached, yet she kept working. The same men who mocked her began to fall silent, watching as she turned dry soil into green again. The fields began to bloom, slowly, stubbornly, like her spirit. Still, nights were hard. She missed the sound of his voice, the way he had finally begun to smile again before the storm took him. But when the wind passed through the wheat, she swore she could hear him whisper, "You were my light." That was enough to keep her going. Months passed. The harvest came, golden and full, and Ayesha stood beneath the same sun that had once burned her tears away. She smiled through the sweat and dust, feeling him beside her in every heartbeat. But peace in a woman's life, especially one who works alone, is never allowed to last. One afternoon, as she sold her grain at the market, a group of men whispered behind her back. One of them, the landlord's son, smirked and said, "A widow shouldn't walk alone. You need protection." She ignored him, but his words followed her home. Days later, he came to her door, offering money for her land. You can't survive alone, he sneered. Sell it to me before you lose everything. Ayesha stood tall, meeting his eyes. This land is not for sale, she said. His smirk vanished. Then you'll regret it, he hissed. That night, as darkness fell, she heard footsteps outside, stones hitting her door, voices laughing cruelly. Fear crept up her spine, but she didn't hide. She lit a lamp and sat near the window, clutching Rafiq's old sickle in her hands. You told me to be strong, she whispered to the memory of her husband. Tonight, I will be. By morning, the men were gone, leaving broken fences and trampled crops. Ayesha stood among the ruins, tears burning in her eyes but fire in her heart. She rebuilt everything. One fence, one seed, one sunrise at a time. The villagers began to notice. Some women started helping her quietly, bringing food, lending tools, and whispering words of courage. If she can do it, one said, maybe we all can. Ayesha had unknowingly become something more than a widow. She had become a symbol of defiance in a world that expected her to bow. Months turned into a year, and Ayesha's name began to echo across the nearby villages. The widow who once wept beside a grave was now the woman who turned barren land into gold. Her strength became her armor, her silence her sword. The landlord's men stopped coming. They feared her courage more than her tears. She had faced every storm the world could throw at her and still stood tall, barefoot on the soil that carried her husband's memory. One evening, as the sun dipped behind the fields, she stood by the crops ready for harvest, her hands resting on the same sickle Rafiq once used. I did it, she whispered, her voice breaking. I kept your promise. For the first time, she smiled, not in memory, but in peace. She knew he would have been proud. The wind passed softly, almost like his hand brushing against her cheek, and she closed her eyes, letting the warmth of that invisible touch sink deep into her heart. A few children from the village ran toward her, calling, Auntie Ayesha, teach us to plant like you. She looked at them and saw what her life had become, a lesson in courage, faith, and endurance. She bent down, handing them small seeds. Plant these with love, she said. They grow better that way. As the children laughed and the sky turned gold, Ayesha realized that life had finally bloomed again, not in luxury or wealth, but in peace and purpose. Her tears had watered her strength, and her pain had become her power. The fields whispered her name, the wind carried her story, and somewhere beyond the horizon, she knew Rafiq was smiling. And as the screen fades softly to dusk, Ayesha's voice could be heard one last time, gentle, strong, and full of hope. Every woman carries a storm within her, but only she can decide whether it destroys her, or grows her roots deeper. If this story touched your heart, don't forget to subscribe for more powerful life stories, where pain meets strength, and every ending becomes a new beginning. Rice plant.